Thank you, Ron. Wonderful to be with all of you, and a little embarrassed from that exuberant introduction from Ron, but it's always hard to follow Ron. Thank you for your leadership, Ron. You've been a magnificent partner in the work that we've done over the last 2 years. And speaking of partners in the work that we've done the last 2 years, it's great to see all of you here to be able to talk about our 2012 budget. And what I want to start with, just to give you a sense of what I want to touch on, I want to go back to where we were just a couple years ago and talk a little bit about the context that we began in 2 years ago and that this president began in 2 years ago. Talk about our accomplishments, what we've been able to do together these last 2 years, and how that leads into the broader context for the president's 2012 budget proposal. Second, to talk about the principles of how we formed HUD's budget. Given that context, what choices did we make? What guided our decisions in the budget? And then finally, to talk about the specifics of the budget and how they tie to the president's vision that he laid out in the State of the Union address for winning the future. How do we make sure that we can be a nation that is competitive, that creates the jobs and the economy we need in the 21st century, that makes sure everyone in this country can get in the game, can have access to opportunity, the opportunity that this country was founded on, and how we balanced those needs with the fiscal demands of today. So let me begin with where we began 2 years ago. I look around this room and I think of all the conversations I've had with all of you about what we inherited, what we've been through these last 2 years. I don't need to go into these in details, but sometimes I think it's too easy to forget how far we've come. And I want to say that particularly in the context of thanking you for how far we've come and the work that we've done together. 2 years ago, we were losing over 700,000 jobs a month. Every month. The economy shrank by 6.3% on an annual basis in the quarter that the president came into office. Home prices had fallen every single month for 30 straight months, and consumer confidence had fallen to a 40-year low. Today, there is no question that we've made substantial progress. 1.1 million private sector jobs created in 2010. Borrowers saved, because of the work that we've done together, $22 billion annually, thanks to mortgage modifications and refinancing. We ended that 2.5-year-long slide in home prices, and while housing remains fragile, there is still significant work ahead of us. We are making real progress. The number of homeowners entering foreclosure today is down by 35% from the moment that we started our work in the first quarter of 2009. So we have made real progress, and a great deal of that progress is thanks to the work that each and every one of you has done. And I want to touch on that work for a moment. With our housing counseling partners, we have reached 4.8 million families since April of 2009. 2.2 million of those families receive foreclosure prevention assistance, and our data today shows that a family is about twice as likely to get a successful modification if they have housing counseling assistance. And so that work has been absolutely critical. At the same time, our work with you on the Recovery Act has meant dramatic results. Within 8 days, we had allocated 75% of our funding, and you all got to work in a hurry with that funding. Already today, we have 360,000 homes that have been built or renovated, not underway, but completed, finished renovations or construction on 360,000 homes. Our latest data, just in the last few weeks, 850,000 people, more than 850,000 people, have a stable place to live today that would have been homeless or were homeless thanks to the Recovery Act. The Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program was a huge leap in innovation in the work that we're doing, the first time we've ever funded flexible funding like that, and already more than 850,000 people have been reached with that funding. 245,000 units have had energy efficiency improvements thanks to the Recovery Act. So remarkable progress on the President's goal as well to out-innovate our competitors around the world, starting with our homes. And in this case, affordable housing is leading the way, not following, but leading the way for energy efficiency. I also have to recognize, the President talked about building the government of the 21st century, a federal government that is more collaborative, leaner, there's less duplication, that works smarter as well as harder. And that's something that we've begun to do in the last 2 years. When you think about the kind of partnerships that we formed across federal agencies on sustainability, homelessness, neighborhood revitalization, the kinds of partnerships we formed with all of you, with foundations, with local government and state government, we have made real progress in breaking down the silos that have inhibited progress for too many years. So I'm very proud of the work that we've done together, the progress that we've made on recovery. And we have come far enough that this budget from the President recognizes that we have to, as we continue to make sure the recovery takes hold, as we accelerate that recovery in the year ahead, we also must increasingly turn our attention to the federal budget deficit, because America cannot win the future if our children inherit a mountain of debt. So the President committed across domestic spending, domestic discretionary spending, to a 5-year freeze. This budget more than meets that goal with a net spending level of $43 billion for HUD, which represents a 1% reduction from our 2010 level of $43.5 billion. How do we meet that? We focus on 3 principles to be able to meet the President's goal. First, we need to continue the work of FHA in stabilizing the housing market, but at the same time begin to pull back so that we increase the amount of private capital in the mortgage market. On Friday, we released the administration's plan for mortgage finance reform, and as part of that, we proposed a 25 basis point increase in HUD's annual premium. That will help to stabilize the FHA fund to ensure that it's strong for years to come, for the next crisis, as well as being able to continue to be a powerful force for helping this recovery strengthen in the housing markets. What it also does is to help bring back private capital. As we raise our fees, we see an increasing interest in private mortgage insurance, other capital coming back into the market to shrink our share, and we are predicting lower volume for FHA next year as a result. But the third thing that it does is to raise about $2 billion in revenues that helps to ensure that we can meet the other priorities in HUD's budget. And so that is a critical piece of how we met the President's direction. Second, we have made a priority on protecting existing families in HUD's programs, and I'll come back and say more about that. Finally, we are proposing no new initiatives for HUD this year. Given the fiscal constraints, given the ambitious agenda that we started over the last 2 years with new initiatives, with reforms to existing programs, we felt it was important to continue the focus on initiatives that we've already rolled out or proposed, as well as to redouble our efforts on making sure our core programs are functioning as effectively as possible. Let me come back to our priority on renewals. Each of you knows this as students of HUD's budget, but I want to reinforce it because it is critical in the choices that we made this year. The vast majority of HUD's budget each year goes to help families that are already living in HUD-assisted housing, already benefiting in some way, whether it's current recipients of rental assistance, whether it's residents of public housing and the upkeep of their public housing stock. 80% of our 2012 budget will go to renewing existing subsidies in our rental assistance programs, fully funding the accrued needs of our public housing stock, and fully renewing our homeless assistance grants. But in a world where, as you know, those programs continue to grow, in fact, the need now, given the recession that we're coming out of, is greater than ever. Given that need and the growth in those programs, even though inflation is lower, we expect about a 1% growth in those core programs. If we're going to keep spending level in HUD's budget, a 1% growth in those renewals means a 4% reduction in everything else, just to keep level. So that is the challenge that we were facing this year. It is a priority we felt was the right priority for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, the need for our rental assistance has only grown as a result of the recession. In 2009, we measured the worst-case housing needs, and we found that over 7 million very low-income renters pay more than half of their income in rent. And in fact, the change in that number between 2007 and 2009 was a 20% increase, the single largest increase that we have ever seen in the history of the worst-case housing needs study. And so immediately on coming into office, the importance of those programs, of all of our core rental assistance programs, was absolutely the greatest that it's been on record in terms of our worst-case housing needs report. In addition, our point-in-time count, the most recent one, measured 650,000 people homeless on that given night in January 2010. Again, while we've made progress on chronic homelessness, that represents an increase, particularly given the number of families that we've seen entering homelessness as a result of the recession. So the need for our rental assistance and our core programs is growing. But in addition to that, we need to recognize that the families that we serve are among the most vulnerable of anyone in the U.S. Extremely low-income families make up 72% of our HUD-assisted households. Fully 54% of HUD-assisted households are elderly or people with disabilities. And the median income of HUD-assisted households was $10,200, roughly 1/6 of the median income across the U.S. So given the importance of those renewals and our commitment to fully funding those renewals first, we had to make difficult choices in this budget. And as the President has said, as Jack Lew has said, these are choices that we do not relish. These are choices that we would not have made in different fiscal circumstances. These are programs that work, that are effective, and yet because of the fiscal circumstances, we cannot fund as many new units or investment in new projects, new programs, as we could in prior years. And so you'll see that in Section 202 and 811, we have proposed reductions relative to the 2010 funded level. In addition to our block grants, CDBG and Home, each of them we're proposing a reduction to those programs. I do want to recognize the amount of these cuts is between 5 and 10% for each of the programs, and I particularly want to focus on 202 and 811, where last year we proposed no new construction and said we want to see reforms to those programs before we would propose funding new construction in those programs. And in fact, working closely with many people here today, we were successful in getting far-reaching reforms in the lame duck Congress in December to 202 and 811, and we are keeping our promise to restart new construction under 202 and 811, albeit at a somewhat lower level than we were able to fund in 2010 because of the difficult choices that we've had to make this year. Despite those tough choices that we've had to make, however, I want to be very clear that this budget allows us to deliver on the promises that the President made in the State of the Union to win our future, to out-educate, out-innovate, out-build our competitors, and to deliver to the American people a reformed federal government. And we're doing this through focusing like a laser on the 5 key goals we laid out in our strategic plan. Let me talk about how each of those goals allows us to win the future. First of all, we can't grow this economy, we can't accelerate the pace of job growth without a stronger recovery in the housing market. And so, as I mentioned, FHA and Ginnie Mae will continue to play key roles in that housing recovery. We are continuing to strengthen them not only through the premium increases, but through a range of other reforms on risk management and others. And we will continue to work with Congress to try and get legislative changes to allow us to continue to reform FHA this coming year. And FHA and Ginnie Mae's role, as I said earlier, will shrink somewhat. We're expecting, the budget is founded on expected volume of $218 billion for FHA's key single-family program. And in total, we expect Ginnie Mae would have new guarantees of $278 billion this coming year. That includes not only additional programs, but also the VA and USDA loans that are so critical today that Ginnie Mae securitizes. You'll also see in the table at the bottom the total guarantee limitations that we're proposing, well above our expected volume, but obviously we want to make sure that FHA is able to respond and Ginnie Mae is able to respond should our volume exceed our projected levels. We're also proposing to keep the elevated level of investment in housing counseling. We raised that investment by about 25% a couple years ago, and we want to continue to see that elevated level of investment in housing counseling. This is just for HUD's programs. In addition, the budget proposes NeighborWorks funding separately as well to continue to make sure that we have assistance available to those struggling to stay in their homes. Let me talk for a moment about our rental assistance programs and the key role that they play. Despite the difficult choices we had to make in this budget, we expect to serve more families, significantly more vulnerable families, in 2012 with this budget. This budget would support 5.5 million families, which would be 86,000 more than we were able to serve in 2010. It provides $1 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, and it proposes a reduced level of funding, but $200 million for a demonstration program to preserve public and assisted housing. This is a conversation that began last year. We want to work closely with all of you and with members of Congress to make sure that we can preserve public housing in a world where there's going to be increasing pressure, as we saw just last week, increasing pressure on the Public Housing Capital Fund, and there continue to be $20 to $30 billion of unmet needs in public housing. We have to find creative ways to ensure that we preserve public housing. And one thing I'd like to mention here, it's not in HUD's budget, but it is in Treasury's. We're proposing, as a result of discussions we had with many of you last year about preserving public housing, we're proposing a basis boost in the 4% low-income housing tax credit for preserving public and other assisted housing. That would mean that there would be an increase in resources in low-income housing tax credits for preserving public and assisted housing. It's an important proposal. It's one that came out of discussions where you all said, if we're going to open public housing to low-income housing tax credits, we need to grow the pie. and we've proposed that together with Treasury in the budget this year. And again, I want to emphasize these programs are absolutely critical in normal times, but they are particularly critical given the recession that we're emerging from today. And you see here the depth of need and the share of extremely low income in each of our major rental assistance programs in the chart on this page. Just to give you a bit of the details to go through quickly here, we're proposing $855 million increase in the Housing Choice Voucher account to meet the increased need for renewals. We're proposing a roughly just over $1 billion increase in the total tenant-based account. And to be clear, that increase looks larger because in this year we're proposing to include the 811 mainstream vouchers, their renewals, in the tenant-based account, not in the 811 account. So that makes this increase appear to be larger, but that's an important reform that would make sure that we protect the 811 renewals going forward. And then we also are proposing an $868 million increase to our project-based Section 8 account to fully meet all renewals. On the Public Housing Operating Fund, we are proposing full funding, which would be a $187 million increase, but we are doing so through a proposal to use, as we've done in the tenant-based accounts in prior years, excess reserves in the Public Housing Operating Fund to be able to fund that. So about $1 billion in reserves. We've seen those reserves grow by well over $1 billion over the last few years. And in a context of making difficult choices, we felt it was important not to do across-the-board cuts that could lead to loss of units, not to do cuts in other rental assistance programs, but where we saw excess reserves, to be able to utilize those to make sure that the operating fund was fully funded. On the capital side, Public Housing Capital Fund, we are also proposing full funding. What you see here, a $95 million reduction, is accounted for by ROSS, Resident Opportunity Supportive Services, being allowed as a use of the regular capital funds, so no longer having a set-aside, but making it an eligible use of all the capital funds, as well as a few small demonstration programs that were funded in previous years that we're not proposing. But to be clear, the core formula Public Housing Capital Fund is fully funded in the proposal. On the home side, we are proposing a $175 million reduction. I mentioned that before in some of the difficult choices that we've had to make. And the preservation demonstration, as I mentioned earlier, is funded at $200 million, a substantial reduction from the TRA proposal last year because of the circumstances that we're facing on the broader budget. A third goal, beyond helping to stabilize the market and to ensure rental assistance and rental housing is a key part of our economic recovery. A third goal in our strategic plan was the potential for using housing as an important platform for improving the quality of life of many populations, while at the same time reducing what we spend in more expensive settings like nursing homes, reducing what we spend on the chronically homeless by connecting housing to services. So this is the smarter government the President talked about in the State of the Union. This budget would do that by doubling the number of permanent supportive housing units that we could produce this year compared to last year. That is a key part of our promise to ensure that the first ever federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness, Opening Doors, continues the progress that we've already made, the funding that we've provided here, as well as providing crucial rental assistance and to fund new units for elderly and disabled individuals and families. In terms of specifics here, we're proposing a $757 million funding level for 202, a reduction from $825 million that was enacted in 2010. And for 811, we're proposing a reduction to $196 million. Just to be clear on the math here, this will look like a bigger cut because $300 million was the level that was funded in total in the 811 account in 2010. $87 million of that was for mainstream voucher renewals. Those renewals are being moved to the tenant-based account, and so on an apples-to-apples basis, the reduction that we're proposing in 811 renewals and pracs is from $213 million to $196 million. On HOPWA, we're proposing level funding given the President's commitment to meeting our plan for AIDS and people living with HIV. So that's a critical part of that investment. On our homeless assistance grants, given that this is the first year we'll be implementing the HARTH legislation, critical new elements of our homeless strategy going into effect this year on rural housing, on ensuring that the critical work we've done with HPRP and the Recovery Act on prevention and rapid rehousing can continue through the Emergency Solutions Grant, renamed from the Emergency Shelter Grant. We are proposing a significant increase to our homeless assistance grants to almost $2.4 billion to implement all of the new elements of HARTH. We are also proposing a reduced but still important level of funding for joint vouchers that we would implement with HHS towards the chronically homeless and families at risk of homelessness. 7,500 vouchers there instead of the 10,000 that we proposed in 2011. That would be a $57 million cost. And we are also proposing to fund 10,000 new VASH vouchers. Last year, we did not propose funding them because the utilization of those VASH vouchers was lagging. We've worked very closely with partners here and at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we now have had dramatic success in improving the lease-up of VASH and are asking for another 10,000 vouchers in 2012 to continue the President's pledge to end veterans' homelessness by 2015. The fourth goal in our strategic plan was to build inclusive and sustainable communities free from discrimination. And these are critical investments that will help us win the future in the way the President laid out in his State of the Union address by driving economic growth and opportunity in communities around the country. Our direct investments and indirect investments from our appropriated programs in this budget overall will create or retain 650,000 jobs. But importantly, beyond the immediate job creation, is helping to fund the planning and implementation of efforts that will make metropolitan areas, rural regions, more economically competitive for the long term, so that that job growth isn't just an immediate effect, but a long-term effect, as the President talked about. Choice Neighborhoods, a $250 million investment there, is critical because if we don't have everybody able to contribute, if we don't have every child in this country able to live up to their potential, to get the education that they need, we will not raise the educational standards, we will not be able to out-educate our rivals around the world, as the President called on us to do. And so we are proposing $250 million there to be able to continue the progress made under Hope 6 and to be able to partner more strongly with the Department of Education on Promise Neighborhoods, but also with the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, so many other departments to bring coordinated investment into neighborhoods of concentrated poverty and to help them achieve their potential. We're also proposing continuing to invest in our Sustainable Communities initiative to coordinate housing, land use, and transportation investments to ensure that we make regions in this country more economically competitive. When the average American family today spends 52 cents of every dollar they earn just on housing and transportation, as capital is more and more mobile in this economy, and companies are following people to the places that have the highest quality of life and the greatest vitality, we need to make sure that American regions are ready to compete and are making the kind of investments not just in the infrastructure the transportation infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure that the President talked about in the State of the Union, but making sure the location of those investments, the way that they're planned relative to our housing, is smarter and more economically competitive. That is a key part of what Sustainable Communities is doing. And so we've proposed, even in these difficult times, to continue that $150 million investment this coming year. Again, getting into the numbers here, for CDBG, a critical part of our strategy to help every community around this country be more economically competitive, we are proposing a reduction. You'll see in the formula amount, and I would just say, I believe that the presentations you may have are an older version that may have these numbers wrong. So I would just highlight the numbers that you see on the screen are the correct ones. For CDBG in total, we're proposing a reduction to $3,800,000,000. That looks like a bigger decrease than it otherwise is because we're pulling Sustainable Communities out of the CDBG account into a separate account. This year, the key number to look at is the formula amount, where we're proposing a $300 million reduction, or 7.5%. Again, a difficult choice, not one we would have made in other times, but also I would say significantly smaller reduction than maybe many of you were expecting, and one that we think is that high level of continued investment is justified by the important economic benefits that CDBG brings. You see the Sustainable Communities funding. We also need to make sure that as we're helping communities be economically competitive, that we're ensuring everyone can participate in that access to opportunity and that success. And that means we need to make sure we're continuing to raise our game on enforcement of the fair housing laws and to advance affirmatively furthering fair housing and the other responsibilities of this department across our programs. And so we propose $72 million for funding for fair housing and equal opportunity, which is level funded from 10, but is an increase from the proposal that we had last year. We are not proposing this year, again, our catalytic investment fund. Instead, the administration is proposing a multi-agency successor to the empowerment zones. You'll see $40 million reflected in EDA's budget. We'll be working closely with EDA on a competitive program that will allocate better targeted, better job-creating tax breaks to a set of areas chosen as the empowerment zones were through a competition in 2012. Those targeted tax breaks would total $2.5 billion over 10 years, and the $40 million that is in EDA's appropriated amount of $40 million in EDA's budget would be planning grants that would go along with that competition for the successor to the empowerment zones. So that's a key interagency initiative that HUD will be part of. We have chosen to fully fund the Native American programs this year because of the dire needs in those communities, particularly as a result of the recession. And then you see the $250 million investment in choice neighborhoods here. Finally, our fifth goal for HUD, as you know, is transforming the way that we do business. And as the President said eloquently in the State of the Union, while we argue often in Washington about big government versus small government, private sector versus public sector, we all know that an effective HUD is about smarter government. It's about making the right investments that will help the people who are most vulnerable in this country succeed, that will help to make our cities, our states, our regions, our counties more economically competitive. And we need to continue the work that we've done on making HUD a more effective agency through this budget. And in particular, I want to focus on the continued investment that we're asking for in our transformation initiative, up to $120 million, which is smaller than we had in 2010. That jump-started many important projects. A continued investment of $120 million is critical for three different key priorities in the transformation initiative. First of all, we've done a great deal to become an agency that isn't just about compliance, isn't just about checking the box, but is a true partner to communities around the country. And we've done that through expanding and making more flexible our technical assistance and capacity building that we do. Two key things that would be supported by our investment in the Transformation Initiative. We would establish a national resource bank, which is an interagency and non-government team as well of technical assistance that could be brought to the most challenged places around this country to help them build their capacity, not just to use HUD programs, but to do economic development and to build their economies in their regions. And that is something that we'll be rolling out this spring in a set of targeted places around the country, likely to start with 5 or 6 locations where we'd assemble an interagency team and bring resources to those places on an as-needed, on-demand basis to target those things that are holding back areas like Detroit and many others from achieving economic success. This builds on the work that we've done in what we call One CPD, taking all of the technical assistance that we did in a disconnected, program-specific way and connecting it through one NOFA for one CPD, where a city, an agency can come in and get help with all of the various programs that we're implementing through CPD. We've heard great feedback on this model where it's been implemented so far, and we're excited about the NOFA that's on the street now to be able to holistically build the capacity of our partners in CPD programs around the country. The second major area that we would invest in with the Transformation Initiative is research and demonstrations. You heard the President say we need to stop doing what doesn't work, and we need to do more of what we know works. Well, we can't know what works unless we have the capacity to do research and to try things through demonstrations that the Transformation Initiative gives us. We've implemented this past year a new HUD Stat focus where we are tracking our progress every month on the major strategic goals that we have at the agency. We're tracking it nationally, we're tracking it in regions to make sure that we're accountable for success. And this money would also fund major evaluations of FSS, family self-sufficiency, rent reform, and admin fees in public housing, and our vouchers, among a number of other key demonstrations and evaluations that we would do. And then finally, we all know that we can't be a 21st century agency without improved technology, information technology. And so this is key, the Transformation Initiative, in terms of investments in key systems here, and particularly FHA modernization is a major priority, as is the next generation voucher management system to ensure that public housing authorities around the country can better manage, more effectively manage, with less requirements, less oversight and bureaucracy from HUD, their voucher programs. So as you can see, this is a budget that recognizes the difficult times that we're in, but just as the President laid out in the State of the Union, it continues to allow us to invest in the critical priorities that we have and to make sure that we advance all of the key strategic goals that we have at HUD. Thank you for joining us here today. Would love to take any questions you may have.
Mr. Secretary, excuse me, Paul Weech from the Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future and the Housing Partnership Network.
Good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you, Mr. Secretary. Thought I'd break the ice and first of all applaud all the great work that the department's doing to try and cross silos here. There's a team that's looking at the RHS and the HUD programs and the LIHTC programs that's really digging into the weeds, and I think that's, you know, it's tough work and I applaud them for doing it. So my question's sort of getting at the silo stuff. And in your last year, the 2011 budget, you relied often on the low-income housing tax credit program to fill in capital gaps in the HUD programs. In your remarks today, you talked about a basis boost for the 4% credits in the LIHTC budget. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And specifically, is it going to be targeted just to the HUD inventory in the use of those resources?
Thank you, Paul. And as I mentioned, I do think this is a critical part of how we ensure that public housing doesn't, if we can make public housing better eligible for tax credits. Obviously, Hope 6 has been a major user of tax credits, but if we could make public housing more broadly eligible, one of the concerns we heard from stakeholders last year was but wait a second, you're just putting more competition for a limited pie. And so this was a key part of our response. We took that seriously. We sat down with this interagency team that you talked about that's done great work. Treasury was very engaged, very interested in trying to find a solution. And so what we're proposing is that the basis boost that has been available, it's roughly 30% basis boost, would be available for preserving federally assisted housing. It doesn't just cover HUD assisted. It's not just public housing, because preservation broadly has been a key strategy, and in particular, the bond and 4% credit programs have been absolutely critical on the preservation side. The 9% obviously when you're doing gut or new construction, but for sort of more straight ahead preservation of the kind that really has been dramatically needed around the country given the fiscal crisis, it would really help on those 4% credits to be able to do that. So it is broader than just HUD assist. One other thing I would mention as well, one of the things I think we've all struggled with is the ability to use the credit in a mixed income context. And in particular, and I saw this when I was allocating credits in New York City, the number of people sort of needing to come in just at that 50% or 60% of area median income level often leads to sort of perverse outcomes in terms of who gets served by the credit program. One of the things we're also proposing is to allow income mixing in the tax credit, so that in a particular property you could go up to 80% of AMI if you had a similar number of units that went down at the same time. So it allows you to average incomes across a development rather than everybody having to meet the same standard. We think this will create more flexibility to do mixed income, particularly with HUD-assisted properties where 80% of AMI is the limit. But the other thing it will do is encourage more units that are targeted to extremely low income. So with the funding that we're proposing for the National Housing Trust Fund, we are hoping that that will be a good complement with it to make sure that we get tax credits that are targeted at 30% of AMI units or even below that. I would also just mention, for those of you who haven't read our full 31-page blueprint for the future of housing finance, we did call for a consistent, transparent, targeted fund for affordability. It was really based on the model of the National Housing Trust Fund that was to have come from revenues from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Given what the options are for the future of the system, we didn't lay out a detailed proposal because it could vary depending on what the ultimate outcome of the reforms is. But we said very clearly there needs to be a targeted set of affordable housing funding separate from appropriations that comes out of the reformed mortgage finance system. So we're funding $1 billion in the short run, but we believe there needs to be a source of funding in the long run as well, independent of what the ultimate shape of the mortgage finance system looks like. Next question.
Yes, hi, Megan Booth with the National Association of Realtors. When you talk about sustainable communities, you talk about the goal of coordinating housing and land use and transportation. Yet FHA penalizes condominium developments where there's mixed use or commercial properties. How do you reconcile that?
I think this is an area where we have a fair amount of work to do, and it's not just on the single family side, it's also on the multifamily side. I think there are a range of barriers to mixed income, mixed use developments that we've begun to break down, and I think Carol Galante's done good work on this. The percentage that we allow in commercial income, our experience on leases rather than on fee simple ownership. There's a range of ways that I think we can improve our programs for mixed use, mixed income developments that would allow us to support our sustainable communities agenda better. We have made changes on our environmental restrictions, and that's been an important step forward. Specifically on the condominium issue, I think the problem there, frankly, has been, as I think everyone knows, that we've had major challenges in the condominium market. And we've had to take a balance between, what percent of units sold, what restrictions we have before we can declare a plan effective and begin funding units there. And we've tried to strike a balance. We haven't gone as far as some others have in changing our criteria there, but it's something that we continue to look at. And if you have specific ideas there or proposals, obviously let's keep working with Dave Stevens on that as well. Toby.
Mr. Secretary, Toby Halliday from the National Housing Trust. I want to add my thanks to you for all your leadership and to the department for its hard work in what is obviously a very difficult budget and policy environment. I have another question on the sustainable communities issue. You've requested $150 million for this in the next year. And I think, as you know, there are over 250,000 HUD-assisted units of affordable rental housing near existing or planned transit nodes in cities around the country. Can you, and all of those 250,000 units, all of those are at risk of conversion to non-affordable use. Can you talk a little bit about how that funding would help to preserve units that are at risk of being lost and displacing existing low-income households to places that are more dependent on vehicles for access to jobs and services?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and I think the sustainable communities funding is a critical piece of it, but it's only one piece of how we're doing that. We have explicitly said in our NOFA that we want to see, as we get applications for that funding, particularly for the challenge grants, the local grants that tend to focus on whether it's inclusionary zoning or other strategies that are more locally based around new transit nodes, things like that. We want to see an emphasis on preservation of existing affordable housing in those communities, because one of sort of the risks, if you will, of transit-oriented development where you're increasing densities, where value is created by the transit investments that are there, is that it can push conversion of existing affordable housing to market rate. And so we have made one of the criteria in the NOFA an explicit request, if you will, of grantees that they focus on that and to make it part of the competitive scoring of those grants. So that's a critical part of making sure that there's affordable housing, as well as creation of new affordable housing through inclusionary or other measures. But I would also just say quickly that there are a range of other things we can do on that front as well. Go back to our multifamily programs in FHA. We used existing authority to take land cost out of the basis for loan limits that allowed us to significantly increase the types of properties that we could fund in the highest cost areas. That's one example of a way that we've tried to make more mixed use, mixed income development near transit-oriented development eligible for our programs to do more on funding on that basis. And we want to continue to work on other things that are going to make those properties particularly able to be preserved. I think this basis boost as well can be an effective tool to try to make sure that we preserve those properties in areas that have new transit investments.
Jeff Alkison with National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, as always, for this briefing. It's very helpful to us and our members. Two-part question on preservation. NARO, along with many other organizations, submitted comments in response to the Housing Trust Fund proposed rule a few weeks ago. Although we have a broad membership, so there are many reasons to be interested in the shape of that program, we were concerned that the rules would prohibit the use of Housing Trust Fund dollars to preserve public housing. So we commented on that, not surprisingly. But it seems somewhat quixotic since we still don't have Housing Trust Fund dollars to actually apply to some of these problems. This is the third year in a row that the HUD budget talks about capitalizing the Housing Trust Fund with $1 billion, but to the best of my knowledge, we still haven't seen an administration legislative proposal to actually accomplish that. So the first question is this the year when we'll actually see legislative language from the administration that lays out their plans for capitalizing the fund? And the second part of my question also on preservation, has to do with the TRA demonstration. Can you talk just a little bit about how the demonstration would differ from Petra or from Representative Ellison's bill, at least the version introduced in December? For example, it looks like there's some movement in the direction of the industry in allowing perhaps conversions to the existing Section 8 project-based rental assistance program, but we're still digesting this language. So, for example, would this allow a PHA to simply convert a public housing property to the existing Section 8 PBRA program, as we've advocated for a number of years, without a bunch of additional regulatory requirements being grafted onto that property as the result of a competitive process?
Yep. So let me start with the second question first. And let me say generally, I think it's pretty clear to me, and I think to the team working on this here, that we should have done a better job than we did last year of engaging folks around this proposal early on. And so I want to frame what we've proposed in the budget very much as listening to what we've heard as feedback. It's a smaller demonstration. It's more focused on public housing. The only focus that we would have beyond public housing is on the so-called orphan programs that desperately need a fix, that came very close to getting a fix in the lame duck and didn't quite get there. That's the RAP and the rent sup and the mod rehab units that we're losing every day on the assisted housing side. So it's smaller, more targeted. It also would allow more flexibility, for example, to convert to existing programs. We particularly are focused, because we've heard a lot of feedback from small housing authorities, on the ability to have more flexibility. So yes, it has evolved in those ways. What I would say, though, beyond that is that this is a starting point for a discussion. We've heard, given the changed landscape in Congress, a real interest in this on both sides of the aisle, sort of folks saying, you know, why is it that we can't have access to private capital in public housing, whereas we can in every other kind of affordable housing? How is it that we can streamline programs, make them simpler and more effective, and have innovative ways to bring capital that don't just depend on appropriation? So we've heard a basic interest. The way we're entering this is the beginning of a conversation, and we want to have, starting immediately, now that the budget is out, detailed discussions with all of you and with the colleagues on the Hill to say what kind of shape of a demonstration makes sense, which elements, and let's have more of a conversation this year on what that looks like. So yes, there are a set of details that have changed, but I want to be very clear, we're not sort of locked in on exactly what this would look like. We see it as a starting point for those discussions. I would also say one of the key things that's, that we are proposing is elements of SEVRA in the budget. This is exactly what I think we ought to be doing, ways to simplify the program, make it more effective, make the lives of housing authorities simpler by, for example, allowing people on fixed incomes to only recertify every third year rather than every year. And by the way, it saves $150 million. So these are exactly the kind of things that we ought to be looking at, and SEVRA is proposed, there's language to be proposed in the budget that would be part of the budget and save $150 million a year with that streamlining. Your other question was about the trust fund. So to be clear, what we're proposing and have proposed is mandatory funding for the trust fund, not discretionary. And the problem, as I've learned over the last few years, not being an expert on mandatory funding when I came in, is that this really depends on legislation that would move at some point during the next Congress. And we haven't proposed a specific offset, language on a specific offset, because frankly, whatever offset might be available is fine with us. And frankly, locking in on one particular offset up front isn't a great strategy, because if for some reason that offset gets used for something else, or it's one that's unpopular and doesn't end up getting passed, it's not something that, you know, we want to hook our train to just one particular thing that we might lose on. And so our strategy has been to try to be opportunistic about where there were bills moving. And so, for example, when the tax extender bill moved, we pushed very hard and came very close to getting $1 billion there. We identified a particular offset as that bill moved through the House. It was used in the House bill, and then ultimately ended up not getting through the Senate in the lame duck session. So we have been pushing in the administration. We've been pushing on a sort of a path that is where we find an opening, where there's a bill that moves, where it could be attached. We're going to come up with an offset. We'll continue to do that. And we've already begun sitting down and working with friends of the trust fund on the Hill to try to figure out what the next available vehicle is. And we should sit down and do that going forward.
Doug Rice, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Just a quick comment and then a question. The comment is we clearly need to get the nation's fiscal house in order, but at the same time, at least I strongly believe that deficit reduction should not be achieved by ways that increase poverty, homelessness, and other serious housing hardships. And for this reason, we think it's very important to see the rental assistance increases in the budget that are there for rental assistance renewals, and also the funding for homeless assistance. And we certainly appreciate the fact that the administration continues to make those a priority. The question has to do with the transforming rental assistance proposal. In last year's budget, there was $50 million, I believe, set aside to fund services for families to improve housing choices and neighborhood opportunities. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't see that in the budget this time around. And I'm interested to know if that represents a change in policy or approach, or was an oversight, or something else.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Doug. And I appreciate your appreciation of the targeting and the sort of choices that we've made. They're not easy choices. And as the president has said very clearly, these cuts are painful to him personally, as somebody who's worked in public housing, CDBG, and some of the other things. You know, these are not things we would propose in normal economic times. So specifically on the mobility piece, one of the things that I think we heard clearly last year was that the demonstration was too complicated. We had too many things that we were trying to accomplish at once. And so what we've chosen to do this year is to simplify it. And we are actually going to be pursuing the mobility strategies, the counseling, some of the other things that were proposed as part of the demonstration last year separately. So we have identified through our TI, Transformation Initiative, for example, and some other sources, funding to be able to do the same things that we proposed last year as part of the demonstration separately. So you didn't miss it. It's not included in the demonstration this year. We continue to believe that it's critical that we do, as all the lessons we've learned from moving to opportunity and other things, that we continue to refine and help housing authorities do mobility in a way that supports those kind of moves successfully. And so it is something we're pursuing. We're just not pursuing it through this demonstration. We're trying to simplify the demonstration and make sure that we get something done this year that we can all agree on. So, but happy to talk to you more about what we're pursuing on a separate track.
Mr. Secretary, John Murphy with NALFA and NACID. Thank you for your leadership and all things housing at the federal level. We certainly appreciate that. And I want to make a couple of comments and then a question. First, I want to echo my friend Paul Weech and complimenting the administration for the 2 low-income housing tax credit proposals. We think the income averaging and the basis boost are very important tools to have in the affordable housing arsenal. As you know, local elected officials and their practitioners are not happy about the cuts in CDBG and home. Clearly, they're not as bad as what was rumored in early January, but nonetheless, we're deeply disappointed. I'm glad you clarified that the Housing Trust Fund is proposed at mandatory spending, not an appropriation, because the budget documents don't make that clear at all. And it appears though those programs are being traded off against the Housing Trust Fund. As all of us in this room know, the House is now proposing very deep cuts through the end of fiscal 2011 in the continuing resolution, and I wondered if you had any comment on that.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question because it's a little bit of a parallel universe in some ways to have the conversation about 12 without acknowledging the uncertainty about 11. I mean, to be very clear, where we end up on renewals, where we end up in many of our programs, it's frankly, it's hard to know what 12 looks like and whether funding will be adequate without knowing more about where we end up in 11. So, you know, we're here today with a lot more uncertainty than we would typically have. And, you know, what I would say is what the House has put out on Friday is the beginning of a process which is obviously going to be difficult, and there's going to be a lot of discussion over the coming weeks. The President's made very clear, and I'll echo, you know, and this budget shows we're serious about fiscal discipline. We recognize that we're going to have to make some painful cuts. We've done that in HUD's budget. The ones you just talked about, I'm not happy about either. You're not happy, you're disappointed. I'm disappointed that we had to make those cuts, but I do believe it's a responsible thing to do given what we're facing more broadly. And so the President is going to work with the Republicans and the Democrats on the Hill to find a way to reduce the deficit. What we can't do is cut in a way that's indiscriminate, that damages the very recovery that we're trying to encourage. And that's going to be the discussion over the coming weeks. And what I would say is we have a lot of work to do as partners on this. We have a lot of new members. We have a lot of folks, frankly, who may not even know that a CDBG block grant or a home block grant ends up supporting their local priorities, because oftentimes, you know, one of the blessings and the curses of these block grants is, and I knew this as a local official, it sort of felt like my money, right? And it's not always clear that the federal government is part of what's happening at the local level. So, and this is true, I mean, CDBGs, we've started to look at the broad range of the way CDBG benefits local communities. Most people have no idea that the child care provided by the YMCA is dependent on CDBG funding. They have no idea that a whole range of other key services that they don't ever connect with HUD, much less the federal government, are supported by CDBG. We've got a lot of work to do together to educate about the importance of these programs, and we've begun that work, and we want to sit with every one of you in the next few days and be able to help with the data that we've put together to help educate folks around the country about what the real impact of these difficult choices are. And that's something that needs to happen immediately. So I thank you for asking the question. As we're starting the discussion today about 12, none of us should forget that 11 is absolutely critical, and it is very much in discussion even as we speak. And the next couple weeks are going to be key. I think it's going to be a real challenge to get this resolved by March 4th when the current CR expires, so we may see another short-term CR from there. But we've got to move very quickly to make sure we're getting understanding about the importance of these programs out into the world. Thanks.
Mr. Secretary Carl Cohen.
Hey, Carl.
I don't know what organization I'm with, but I've been around here for a while. I did read your white paper on housing over the weekend, and I must say I was disappointed. I thought it lacked sufficient detail as to the future. But one thing that did come through, which was very disappointing, was the concept being expressed that FHA, single-family mortgage insurance, is for low-income people, and has always been. That is just absolutely not true. It never has been a low-income program. Even 235 was not a low-income program. It was more of a moderate-income program. And that's where we did have to put subsidy in to increasing home ownership. And that is a significant disappointment, and I think a bad mistake, because to the extent that you cut back on that program for the people who are not considering themselves low income, you increase what I think is, I call the jealousy factor. That is the perception by people who don't really need much subsidy, but need some support, that you're really orienting everything towards the very low income people. And they tend to look down upon that. Now, that should not be, and I don't support that kind of concept, but I must caution you that that's what can happen, and it's what has happened in the past. And then you say that you look to these shifts in home ownership under the FHA programs to support some of your other programs. And I just don't see it unless you're willing to put money in there. And I know you don't have the money to put in there. So I just caution you and express concern about that.
Yeah. I appreciate your comment, Carl. Let me be clear. I don't think anywhere we say we shouldn't support moderate income people in addition to low income. And this is in two ways, right? One is for FHA in normal times, and then there's a question too about what FHA does as crisis response, as we've seen has been so important. And we do advocate that FHA needs to stand ready. In fact, we need an improved FHA to stand ready to step up, as we've done in this crisis, to serve a broader segment of the market. I think we've got to, and this goes to your question, your point about detail, we've got to get the big decisions first, right? And if we ended up with a system where FHA is the primary provider of a guarantee in normal times, then clearly you'd want to have, that would influence your choice about what the loan limits would be going forward. I think we say very clearly this isn't just about low-income people having access to stable, decently priced credit. It's about low and moderate income people. What we do say clearly is that FHA's role needs to step back. Right now, when you include the VA and the USDA, what Ginnie securitizes, we're 30% of the market. And our loan limits go up to $730,000. And if we disagree on this, then so be it. We think that those limits ought to step down and that we ought to move back towards serving a narrower segment of the market than we are serving right now. And I think that's completely consistent with the history of the low and moderate income folks that FHA has served. How far those limits come down, where you set them, I think needs to be decided based on where you go with the system more broadly, not just on where FHA is alone. And that was frankly why we said they need to go lower than the 625 that they'll go down to in October if there's no legislation passed. But where they go, whether they go back down to the 419 or sort of in that area, that's clear. Overall, though, I think it's clear that somebody at median income or below, which clearly includes low and moderate income, are the kinds of families that we're focused on, not just on those that are below 80 or below 50% of median income.
I'm not talking about the mortgage limits. I think they're probably too high, especially in the more normal times. I mean, some of my friends in the home builders and the realtors may not agree with me on that, but I do think they are too high. But you're giving a message that this is for low-income people, and it's not for low-income people, and therefore you're putting an aura about the program that I think is not good for it. We really had a problem with FHA being cut out of the market because it did not do some of the crazy things that the private market did, and which were not restrained.
Agree on
which
that.
hopefully will now be restrained by the financial reform legislation. But that's really where it was. Yeah. People could get loans that they thought they were going to be in nirvana,
nowhere am I advocating we go back to 2% of the market. Let's just be clear.
But I'm very concerned about the.
We can make sure we can get to the next person.
But that focus, that message gets across as low income, and it's a wrong message.
Well, that's not our message. So.
Mr. Secretary, it's Peter Lawrence from Enterprise Community Partners. I want
Good to see
to follow up on the comments that Paul and John said about the low-income housing tax credit proposals. We heard your message last year about how a lot of housing gets done through the tax credit program, and the fact that the HUD has partnered with the Treasury to produce these proposals is something we're very happy to see. And I think that, also considering the rest of the budget, where we're in the fiscal situation, I think this is a much better budget than we had perhaps feared. And although we certainly are disappointed to see the cuts that they're in, we recognize the fiscal environment that we have. I think the question I wanted just to confirm, this might be a little in the weeds, but I think is important for when talking about preservation and HUD's proposal to transform rental assistance. I think one of the aspects of the proposal on the basis boost is would apply, if I'm reading it correctly, to in certain areas to go even higher than the normal 30% basis boost in order to enable perhaps as much as 60% for deals where the state agency believes it's required to do that. And I think that will be very helpful in circumstances where you are trying to preserve public housing and other more projects that have bigger financing gaps than we've traditionally seen in the tax credit proposal. Could you potentially comment about that?
I think you've said it well, that it can be a real advantage. Look, I think this is one where, particularly given the nature of, we talked about before, how stuff tends to move on the mandatory side, how we get legislation done that might actually implement these is going to take some real work together. And I think it's something where getting a sense of where folks on the Hill are, what potential opportunities there are, it may be that we need to tweak these proposals and refine them to try to build support for them. And so what I would suggest is we need to have a conversation very quickly to make sure we understand what all the elements are that you think are going to be critical, just like this issue of where you already have a boost and how is that treated. I think those are the kind of things we're going to have to work very closely on as we try to plot out a strategy to get this done. Particularly given we don't tend to be the experts on moving tax legislation. So we'll be calling on our partners as well to do that, and we sit down very quickly.
I'm Ted Van Dyke from the Public Housing Authority Directors Association, and I want to thank you for some of the good things that are in the budget. You have added $1 billion to the tenant-based renewal program and close to $1 billion to the project-based assistance program. So it is disappointing that the public housing program has been reduced by $1 billion, and it serves approximately the same number of units that the project-based assistance programs, which is getting funded at $9.4 billion, and public housing is getting funded at $6.4 billion for the same number of units. And it's especially disappointing that this is being done by actually taking money away from housing authorities. And the department in its publication acknowledges that there's a $20 to $30 billion backlog and that the federal government, in essence, can't really fund the program anymore. So it's especially surprising that in those circumstances, HUD would actually take money away from housing authorities by reducing their operating reserves. And the limit, on operating reserves, lifting the limit was a reform that took place in the 90s to try to improve the flexibility that housing authorities have. And if, in fact, operating reserves have increased, it's a demonstration that, encouraging entrepreneurism and flexibility at housing authorities has been successful, and that they have more resources than they might have had otherwise. So my question is, if HUD believes that the operating reserves, that there should be a limit placed on operating reserves that housing authorities should have available, shouldn't that be something that we should debate, we should discuss, we should examine, we should vet, it should be proposed as a proposal, and then if, in fact, some decision was made that was that was agreed upon, then at that point, the idea of recapturing reserves might be looked at.
Well, I guess I would say that that's what we've done in this budget. This is the beginning of a conversation, as you know, with folks on the Hill, with all of you about, whether we should do this or not. Certainly there are things that have been proposed in the past that haven't been enacted. So I think it's fair to say this is the beginning of a conversation about that. We're proposing it. It doesn't mean it's going to become law. Here's the fundamental issue, though. Again, in other economic times, would we have proposed this, or would we have proposed it in the same way? I don't think we would have. But in a world where we have enormous pressures, where housing authorities have built up over the past couple of years, at least based on our data, which we've begun to share, well over $1 billion in additional reserves. It seems difficult for us to justify. We've done it on the tenant-based side, right? We've said we want to send a message to housing authorities. We want to send a signal that using this money quickly and effectively, making sure it's getting to the housing that needs it, and this is operating money, right? We fully funded the capital fund. We want to make sure that this money gets used, and it gets used as quickly as possible. We recognize absolutely you need reserves, and that's why we haven't said, well, it's got to be exactly this for every agency. We want to do this in a way that takes into account of what agencies need, but it's hard, certainly from our perspective, it's hard to look at the level of reserves that are there today, given the needs that we know that are there and the kind of increases that we've seen, and not apply the same logic that we've begun to apply on the tenant-based side, which is to say, let's make sure that you have enough to operate your program, but let's also have an incentive to put money to work as quickly as possible to make sure it reaches the families that need it. And we could have looked at other kinds of reductions. We could have looked at reductions in other programs instead, but this looked to us, based on the data that we have, based on what we know about these reserves, as a way to make sure that we fully fund the operating fund, that there is every housing authority has money to operate their public housing, that they have the full amount that they need without hurting any residents. And that was the view. Again, we want to have a conversation about it if there are reasons why those reserves are being held that we don't know about, or if there's some reason that we need this very elevated level of reserves that we see today relative to history. Let's have that conversation and figure it out. But again, the logic that we've applied somewhere else to tenant-based, it didn't seem to us here why we should look at this in a fundamentally different way than we've begun to look at the tenant-based account. And I also would say, to me, I'd rather go down a route where we can say, look, here's what it takes to operate public housing. Here's the full amount, and we can get that partly through new appropriations, partly through reserves, rather than across-the-board cuts or pro rata reductions, which sort of set a new floor, I think, and could lead to further reductions in future years that would really hurt residents. So I understand your concern. We did not do this lightly. On the other hand, we feel that, reserves well above the level that we think it takes, or at least our sense is it takes to operate effectively, is money that could be going to improve public housing more quickly, and that's what we want to make sure is happening. Other questions? All right. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to conversations about 12, but also about 2011 in the coming weeks.